Okay, welcome everyone to Marx21's discussion today on socialist politics after Sanders and Corbyn. We at Marx21 are happy to be hosting this discussion with Marx21 member Clare Lemlich, who is based in our Los Angeles, California branch, and Charlie Kimber, the National Secretary of the Socialist Workers Party and the editor of the Socialist Worker newspaper in Great Britain. My name is Virginia Rodino, and I'm based in the Baltimore, DC area. If you're interested in joining Marx21, there is a member near you with whom you'll be able to connect, and we will be putting up information in the chat on how we can stay in touch after this meeting. Also, there is a sign-up sheet that we're going to be putting in the comment section, and we'd ask that you please sign up so we can stay connected. So details on how this meeting is going to run. We will ask Claire to speak for around 15 minutes, and then Charlie will follow her. During this time, we hope their talks will provoke questions and comments from all of you, questions which you can submit in the comments section. Please feel free to let us know where you're located when you submit your question. After Claire and Charlie speak, we will pose a couple of questions to them and give our speakers about 10 minutes to respond. After that, we will take another round of questions and give our speakers time to reply and make their final comments. When that's finished, I'll come back to close out our meeting. With that, let's begin. Claire?
Yeah, thank you, Virginia. I think it's kind of impossible right now to talk about anything political in the US today without mentioning the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis last week and the very courageous and inspiring rebellion that we're seeing around the country right now. You know, the cop who executed George Floyd had numerous complaints of violence against him, and the people in charge in Minnesota never prosecuted. And one of the people who could have done that was Amy Klobuchar, the Minnesota senator who ran as a Democratic presidential nominee, dropped out when the Democratic establishment all rallied behind Joe Biden, and now is most likely Biden's VP pick, although we don't know how that will shake out now given this situation. But I think this tells us something about the scale of the crisis in the United States. The police in a democratic state were protected by democratic lawmakers, one of whom might go on to run the country with Biden. And together these Democrats shielded the racist police for long enough that one of them was able to murder George Floyd. And more than that, I think the scale of the resistance that we're seeing is not only about George Floyd, it's about capitalism. It's about a capitalism that's built on Black slavery, capitalism that needs killer cops to function, capitalism that breeds inequality, that's forcing Black people to go to work through the pandemic and killing them at the highest rate in the country. And I think George Floyd's murder would have been enough to riot, but unfortunately, it's actually the tip of the iceberg. And I think we have to understand that people riot because the system is broken. And that's some of the context I want to lay out for talking about Bernie Sanders and the Democrats and what I think we should do next in the socialist left in the US. So we have a historic problem in the US in that there's no mainstream electoral expression of working class politics. Most other capitalist democracies have this. We have labor parties, social democratic parties around the world, and every place is different, but these kinds of parties are usually created out of this groundswell of labor organizing and militancy, and then went on to become the parliamentary expression of that. And these kinds of parties have sold out and betrayed working people again and again and again over the decades. And this happens because these parties that represent working people in name end up having to manage the capitalist state and government once they get into power. So even with the best of intentions, the state apparatus is designed to protect the interests of capital and corporations and not to provide working people with things that we need. The only way we get those things is if we fight. So this is why over the last decade, or more than that, we've seen more third parties, green parties, new left parties emerge around the world. And at the same time, we've also seen right-wing expressions of this, neo-Nazi parties, new right-wing formations form because there's a crisis in mainstream capitalist democracy. The right solution is xenophobia and racism and all of the rest of it, and the left's is social reforms and services. But I think we have to understand both of those trends coming from the same place of mainstream parties failing and collapsing and being in crisis. And so I think that we have to understand both Bernie Sanders and Trump actually is coming out of that context. We know that Sanders has caucused with Democrats for his, entire political career, but I think he's seen very much as an outsider to the Democrat establishment as, as an independent. And Trump is a wealthy, elite, and a lot of other words that I won't use right now, but he markets himself as a, tell it like it is businessman who comes from outside of the Washington establishment. So I think we're seeing this similar trend in the US political system with this polarization and kind of the old ruling systems losing ground and losing people's confidence in a way. So most capitalist democracies have a two-party system of some kind, like we do in the US, but the grip is especially intense in the United States. The closest thing that we have to any kind of social democratic or Labour Party is the Democrats, but they're really not like a Labour Party in so many ways in terms of their structure. So they're not a member organization. A person just becomes a Democrat by registering as one in time to cast a ballot. There is a party platform, but there's no accountability mechanism or requirements for people that run as Democrats to do anything consistent with that party platform. There's no elected or accountable party leadership other than the presidential candidate themselves and kind of a clique of congressional officials. And, these features, I think, make it very, very difficult to hold Democrats accountable on any issue at any level of government. And we see that Democrats get away with all kinds of right-wing garbage because they know that people don't have another voting option if they're to the left. And when a progressive Democrat does manage to get a foot through the door, the Democratic establishment kind of shuts them out, but the left usually puts its weight behind that kind of a candidate. And that makes sense because we're taught like the White House is where political power lies, and it would be better to have a progressive Democrat there than an establishment Democrat or a Republican. But I think the problem with that conception about progressive Democrats is that the left gets quite demobilized in the process of campaigning for them. I think one of the best examples and most recent ones is the anti-war movement. So Obama campaigned as this anti-war candidate, and when he won in 2008, I think the movement really felt like we have an anti-war friend in the White House who's going to end these Republican-led wars in the Middle East. But when Obama actually turned out to be extremely pro-war, the left really struggled to mobilize again because it had put a great deal of effort and energy into getting Obama elected, rather than maintaining a strong anti-war movement outside of the White House, regardless of whether it was a Republican or a Democrat dropping the bombs. And, now I want to talk a bit about Bernie Sanders, who I think is very different from Obama in a lot of ways. But the lesson is important there. I think building an election campaign for a progressive Democrat is not the same thing as building a social movement that's capable of holding that politician accountable. And I don't think that that's a really revolutionary thing to say. I think Sanders knows this. That's why the slogan he put forward is not me, us. It's about a movement of not just him as a politician. Excuse me. And the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, of which I'm a member, also knows this. So at its 2019 convention, its highest decision-making body, the DSA resolved to only campaign for Sanders, not for any other corporate Dems. That was called the Bernie or Bust motion. And the convention resolved to use the campaign as a tactic to build the left more generally, and it affirmed a commitment to ultimately breaking with the Democratic Party, which I think is very important because the DSA has historically had a realignment strategy, which is to realign and reform the Democrats, which I don't think is possible due to the structural things that I mentioned about the party. But the idea of the problems with the Democrats and with breaking with them is being discussed more and more. And I think it's gained some ground in the DSA in the last couple of years, which I think is a positive and necessary step. And, I'm very proud of the work that we've done in DSA, but I think we still have a lot of work to do in terms of realizing that vision from the convention. And I think one step towards that is making a really honest and sober assessment of why Sanders lost the nomination this year. I think I've seen some analysis in Jacobin and some other political sources that say the reason he lost was because the Democratic establishment sold out Sanders. And that's certainly a factor. There's nobody who knows how to crush an insurgent progressive like the Democratic National Committee. But I think we really have to deal with the fact that Sanders got fewer votes this time than he did in 2016. This year, he got 30% of the popular vote before dropping out, compared with 43% last time. And I think this dip has something to do with the DSA's strategy between 2016 and now. And, this is an organization that's extremely diverse, varied political opinions, a lot of different strategies and activities and caucuses. But one of the main strategies that many chapters used in between these two elections was working to elect progressive Democrats at the local level as a way to build power for Sanders this year and to build the left more generally. And I don't think that that's unimportant work, but I think we have to assess whether that has worked like many had hoped. Because sometimes electoral work is an important tactic for socialists, but it really needs to be complementary to a wider national grassroots strategy, not an end unto itself. And I think what we see reflected in the polls around the Democratic primaries is that people generally agree with Sanders' policies. People want Medicare for all, people want a Green New Deal, but they didn't cast a vote for him in the end. And again, I think this has to do a lot with the DSA's strategy. Sanders and the DSA have spread a lot of ideas about social democracy, but we as a left don't have the social weight to actually carry them out in practice, not in the votes, not in the working class institutions like unions, in our communities, in our social movements. And one would think as the largest socialist organization in the country that the DSA would really be on the front foot about calling, for instance, mass nationwide demonstrations around George Floyd's murder. His killer was arrested yesterday because of the rebellion on the streets. And this wasn't DSA called, it wasn't DSA led. Some local actions are certainly being spearheaded by DSA. DSA has been promoting the two actions that in Los Angeles today, one of which I'll be going to after we finish up here today. But where I am in LA, we're attending the marches against the killer cops. We're not leading them. And, I read the DSA national call to action that went out by email yesterday, and it's all of its calls to action were call the Minnesota governor, call the Minneapolis mayor, call the county attorney, and donate to the resistance funds. And again, I don't think any of these things are bad or wrong, but I think actually the most crucially inspiring and winning strategy on the ground in Minneapolis to get that guy arrested is the mass mobilization that put pressure on the state over several nights now. And crucially, the union resolutions against the police, like the Minnesota schools and the universities that are now cutting ties with the police department. I think that's a huge and essential qualitative shift in the response to anti-Black violence in the US. And, I think the focus on elected officials that we saw in the call to action comes from a misunderstanding about where political power in society actually lies. It doesn't lie with the politicians, it lies with us, working people. And unfortunately, I think the DSA, we're less embedded and less powerful than we could be today, precisely because we've spent more time building electoral campaigns than grassroots power. And I think about this in the context of the pandemic as well. I think we should be calling national actions every day, until everyone is housed and everyone has a monthly payment to stay alive, and and the PPE and all of the things that we need to get through this pandemic. But instead, my DSA local chapter, for instance, has mainly been asking members to call city councillors about an eviction moratorium. Again, I don't think that work is unimportant or irrelevant. It's just not enough on its own to build the social power that we need. And it's not clear to me that it's part of a broader mobilizing and organizing strategy. And I don't think it's what our priorities should be. But there are plenty of examples of the kinds of fights I think we should prioritize going forward. The teachers' strike wave in 2018-19, you can see behind me, I have a on strike poster from the 2019 victorious UTLA teachers' strike in Los Angeles. the extremely brave and inspiring strikes for COVID protections in the healthcare industry, fast food, transport, service work. These are, you know, small, the beginnings of something, but they are the beginnings of the kind of resistance I think we need in this country. And then before that, we had the airport protests against Trump's Muslim ban, the women's marches against Trump and sexual violence. And, you know, all of these things I think are starting points and avenues we really need to very seriously go down in the coming months. And, you know, I want to be clear, no one that I've met in the DSA is opposed to mass protest, to non-electoral work, or actually anything that I've said today. And the DSA is involved in all of that kind of activity I just mentioned. And a lot of local chapters do important work in this regard. I think shout out to the comrades in Washington State who are working on strike solidarity with the fruit pickers who've been on strike up there these past couple of weeks. I think that's been brilliant. But, you know, I think it is a question of priorities and a national perspective for building power from the ground up, not primarily in the halls of power at the state or local level or the White House. And I think when we have that kind of social power, potentially a new electoral formation outside of the Democrats might be possible, but I don't think that we can skip any steps to get there. So these are all reasons why I'm a member of Marx21, the group that's putting this meeting on today, in addition to working in the kind of broad left DSA. You know, I think we need to rebuild the revolutionary tradition in the United States that sees fighting for social reforms not just as a goal on their own to improve people's lives in the here and now, but as a conduit to greater working class confidence and consciousness and power and organization. And I think we need an organization that can connect our local fights to a wider national perspective and strategy, an organization that's able to generalize these struggles, learn from our wins and losses, and use those lessons to win the reforms and all the power that comes with that, that we need. And with a strategy like that, I think we'd be able to put on the agenda the ultimate goal of a socialist society in a very real way. You know, there's, I'll wrap up now, there's clearly a hunger for change in this country. I think you only need to look out the window at the demonstrations around George Floyd to see that. And then, you know, all of the other resistance and pain people are going through in the pandemic right now with the unemployment and the loss of healthcare and that sort of thing. People are fed up with politics as usual. But I hope that you'll join us in organizing and channeling the sentiment to go forward after Sanders in the kind of framework that I've laid out today. Okay, thanks, comrades.
Thanks very much for that, Claire. Charlie, would you like to go now, please?
Well, good evening, comrades from East London, Hackney in East London, and it's a privilege to be speaking to comrades in America today. First of all, solidarity with all those fighting in the streets against the racist police, against a racist system, and for transformation in America. And between us, let's hope that we can create a workers' and campaigners' unity against the two most reckless administrations in charge of the coronavirus response. Between them, Donald Trump and Boris Johnson are responsible for 150,000 deaths. They have blood on their hands, and we need unity against both of them. I think the challenge for Sanders, for Corbyn, and for anyone on the left is to answer whether their politics match up to the scale of the challenge we face. We know that every day, particularly in the global south, tens of thousands of people die unnecessarily because of the way that capitalism operates. But more recently, we know that there are three strands of existential threat to people's lives. Nuclear war, which certainly under Trump has never felt more likely than the 1960s. The threat of climate chaos, which until very recently was quite rightly at the absolute center of all our political life and must continue to be there now and in the future. And of recurrent pandemics, which, as we know, are a result of the way that capitalism has operated and expanded. This is the scale of the task in front of us? Do the politics put forward by various forces match up to the social transformation which is necessary and which is urgent? We don't have forever to get rid of capitalist priorities and capitalist policy. So I'm going to speak mainly about Jeremy Corbyn, elected Labour Party leader in 2015, a very successful election campaign in 2017, and then a shattering defeat in 2019 and removed as Labour Party leader earlier this year. Firstly, I want to say that, as Claire put it earlier, he is a reflection of a broader trend. First of all, from the economic crisis of 2007-2009, which led to deep bitterness across large parts of the world against the way the system works, combined with a political disillusionment with those at the top of society, sometimes grasped by the right, the AfD in Germany, the Front National and the Rassemblement National in France of the Le Pens, eventually by Donald Trump, Britain by UKIP of Nigel Farage, great friend of Donald Trump, and other forces, but also very significantly by the left. We know the history of the Tunisian Revolution of 2010, the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, the Great 15 May movement in the Spanish state, the Occupy movement, the election of François Hollande in France against the right-winger Nicolas Sarkozy, and so on. In other words, it wasn't just about an electoral force, it was a force that represented movement from below, a feeling for transformational change. And Corbyn fits into this, not actually as a result of mass struggle in Britain. There was a very big strike in 2011 in Britain over pensions, but he is not the reflection really of mass struggle from below. Corbyn was a reflection of a mood in society. Elected quite unexpectedly as Labour leader, he himself thought he was running just to put forward a set of politics, never expected to become the leader, but he became a focus of all the feeling for change. And his election in 2015 was a massive boost for the whole of the left because it suggested that socialist politics could be popular. It put on the agenda the idea of what socialism was and what was possible. And yet, really, the 4 years of Corbyn has been a very stark lesson for the left about the limitations of reformism. I should say that the British Labour Party is qualitatively different to that of the Democrats. It was formed by the trade union leaders. It has, however tenuously, a direct link to working class organisation and has to reflect more directly the idea of what working class people think. But the truth is that whatever the Labour Party was about, it very quickly showed the limitations of the reformist project. Let me just look at Corbyn's early period. Corbyn was immediately pressured that he had to maintain the unity of the party. We have to win elections. That means we have to be united. On the left, on the right, on the middle, all of us have to come together. And in particular, because we prioritize the parliamentary element of the Labour Party, you have to listen to the MPs who are on the right, who don't agree with Jeremy Corbyn, who don't want transformational change. They were much happier with Tony Blair. You remember Tony Blair, the architect alongside George Bush of the criminal war in Iraq, a very right-wing figure who pushed the Labour Party right. That's the sort of person that most of the MPs liked. And Corbyn was a challenge to that, but immediately made concessions to the idea of unity with the Labour right. Let me just mention too, the first thing he did was to line up with the position of the British ruling class over the question of Brexit, leaving the European Union. He agreed that he would campaign in order to remain inside the European Union and not really be very critical of the European Union. That didn't seem like a massive thing at the time. It rebounded with terrible consequences in 2019, one of the reasons why Labour lost the election in 2019. He also made concessions over something that was incredibly dear to his heart. I've known Jeremy Corbyn for quite a long time. One thing I know about him is that he spent his whole life campaigning against nuclear weapons. But he agreed quite quickly that the Labour Party would have a position of upgrading Trident nuclear missiles, which are the centre of the British nuclear military threat. Now, why did he do that? Because he wanted to keep the trade union leaders on board and because he wanted to keep the Labour right on board. And what I'm talking about is that for all the positives of Corbyn, he made concession after concession. And after the 2017 election, in which he got a very, very good result, showed that a radical manifesto, that an insurgent campaign, that mass rallies, that many of the sorts of things that Bernie Sanders did, these could be popular and energize people and give people hope and a feeling that change could come in society. Very successful 2017. The reality is he got worse because he moved further away from any reliance on mass mobilization, on people doing things for themselves from below, and instead thought that the whole thing was about winning the next election. The whole movement was directed away from mobilization and towards the idea that Jeremy becoming the Prime Minister was the only central thing about which we had to concentrate on. This was disastrous. You see, people who are in parties like the Labour Party, or presumably the Democrats have the same rationale, say, of course, we need to have that movement from below, but we also need to win elections. We're bringing the two things together, a twin track strategy, as it's called in Britain. The problem is which dominates the other, which disciplines the other. And the reality is that the electoral bit, therefore the need to do deals with the right, always dominates over the from below bit. And this is what was so disastrous for Jeremy Corbyn. It meant that when it came to all the crucial fights with the right, there were compromises. Not a single right-wing MP was deselected. The people who were incredibly bitter against Corbyn, and more concessions were made over, for example, the question of Palestine, where Labour eventually gave in to a wholly spurious witch hunt around the question of alleged anti-Semitism, and lined up with saying that to call the Israeli Zionist project racist was in some ways anti-Semitic, a huge and terrible concession towards the right. And this is the reality, that reformism acts as an iron cage upon those who wish to transform society. Corbyn was spared the reality of what would have happened to him if he'd got elected. I wish Corbyn had been elected. We, in the SWP, campaigned for a vote for Jeremy Corbyn both in 2017 and 2019. But I know that had he been elected, the immediate threat would have come from the bosses, from the financiers, from the great powers of the international financial institution, from the bankers and all those other forces, to constrain and to seek to break a Labour administration. And that's not just something I'm creating as a theoretical model. It is that I know the experience of every British Labour government from 1924 right up to the present day. And the experience of all of them was that a brief period of reform then led to investment strikes, led to a run upon the currency, led to a refusal to go along with what that government was doing legally or illegally from the powers inside society. And because of that, those Labour governments began to attack their own supporters. They began to push through cuts. They began to push through attacks on trade union rights. They pushed through racist attacks upon migrants. And because of that, they then ended up demoralizing their own supporters and the return of right-wing governments. And it's not just the experience of Britain, it's the experience internationally. Let me touch upon one, which is the experience of Syriza in Greece. Syriza is again an expression of a huge wave of resistance from below, of general strikes, of mass demonstrations, of student movements, of youth movements, of pensioners movements from below against austerity, implemented by the right wing or by the left, the Social Democratic Party inside Greece, PASOK. Elected in 2015 as the hope of Europe, an anti-austerity party. And yet, within 6 months of its election, it was implementing a worse set of austerity measures than its right-wing predecessor, despite a referendum which had rejected those measures. Why did that happen? It happened not because of the personality of Alexis Tsipras, the Syriza leader. It happened because the constraints laid down to reformist governments can only be breached if people say we are breaking from the system. We are not going to go along with the system as it is at the moment, and instead are basing ourselves on an entirely different set of politics. And what I want to argue is all the key struggles in society, all of them, are in the streets and in the workplaces. This is where real social change comes about. This is what Corbyn turned his back upon. This is what Labourism inevitably turns its back upon. And it then imprisons you, so that now Labour has a right-wing leader, Sir Keir Starmer, which all of those who signed up to support Corbyn are now forced to say, well, Sir Keir isn't great, but nonetheless, we have to get Labour elected, therefore we must line up behind Sir Keir. We know that in America, those who have signed up to say, we will try and get Sanders elected, and we must support the Democrats, are now corralled behind Joe Biden. And therefore, what I think we need to argue is that although it's a difficult road, all of the real wellspring of change in society is in the streets and the workplace, and organizing that form of resistance, which can bring about immediate changes in the here and now, far more effectively actually than the reformists can do. That can also open up the prospect of revolutionary transformation and an abolition of that capitalist system, which offers an existential threat to humanity across the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie and Claire. We have a few questions coming in, and folks, you should still feel free to send in your questions if you have them. Question for Charlie from Yanni in New York. You had just referred to Syriza, and there's no debate about Syriza capitulating and failing as a radical left party. It turned its back on the movements and instead was forced to implement harsh austerity, as you just said. What is Podemos's role now as part of the coalition government in the Spanish state? And what is its attitude towards the Catalan independence movement? Rebecca in San Diego had a question about Sanders. How do you explain the popularity of the policies that Sanders champions, such as Medicare for all, but his inability to gain the votes needed to win the nomination? What was the role of his own campaign, the media, and the Democratic establishment in his defeat? And another question comes from Faylene in Toronto. How would you see socialists' participation? And we'll give our speakers about 10 minutes each to respond to these questions. Claire, did you want to go first?
Yes, sure, I can. Yeah, I said a little bit when I was speaking about kind of the gap between mass support for Sanders policies on the one hand versus what we actually saw shake out in terms of the voting in the primaries. And I think one of the reasons is that like the horizon for people's like political aspirations in the US so low. And I think that that has to do with the Democrats and actually Sanders himself. Sanders from the beginning said, I won't run as an independent candidate if I don't win the Democratic nomination. I will endorse whoever gets nominated. And he went and endorsed Biden extremely quickly. And I think that's kind of in the framework of this slogan we have in the US of vote blue no matter who, which means vote for the worst, most right-wing, most backward, most conservative Democrat, as long as it will get Trump out of office. And I think that that is kind of the mentality a lot of people go to the polls with. It's like, we need a practical candidate, we need a tested candidate, we need someone who's, you know, proven their record in the White House or whatever. I mean, Biden's record in the White House is, you know, anything but progressive. But I think that that's kind of, you know, people feel like, and this is what the Democrats have done. They don't tack to the left. They don't campaign to try and catch the left votes and the left dissatisfaction in society. They race to the center. They want to catch dissatisfied Republicans. And that's where they look to. So they create this kind of political framework for people where it's like, just vote for what's practical, just vote for what's, you know, going to be the most likely to catch all of the conservative votes. So then it feels like there's no, you know, no capacity for people to consider Bernie a practical candidate, even though he was extremely practical and popular. And I think actually his policies are much more practical. If you want to have the earth exist for, you know, any more than 50 years in the future, they are more practical. But I think the Democrats, create this situation where even the progressive Democrats, they self-undermine, they undermine themselves and rush to the center. So I think that's, you know, that's part of the reason that we see like ideological popularity for Bernie, but that doesn't get manifested in the votes. People tend to vote for the realistic candidate, which again is why I think we need a broader left strategy that raises people's political expectations and raises the idea of what's possible. And I'll just say something on Feline's question, because I think it's a good question. What should the left do come the election? I think I don't know that it's clear that there will be an election. I think it's, you know, it's a volatile situation anyway, but I think given the pandemic and everything else that's happening, I don't know if it will happen. If it does, I mean, firstly, Marx21 won't be endorsing Biden and we won't be campaigning for him. I think a politician to get our support and get our campaigning would need to be a serious left contender, and Biden is not. He's anything but that, and he's also a credibly accused rapist, which none of us, I think, are interested in doing any campaigning for. And there's a lot of pressure from the establishment, from the kind of liberal world that we have to get Biden elected to get rid of Trump. But I think the problem with that is that that's how we got Trump in the first place. The idea that you should just vote for the least worst candidate, the strategy that you should vote for the Hillary Clintons and the Bidens of the world, creates the space for people like Trump to get elected and to do what they've done. So I think, you know, I don't think that we can abstain from the question of what happens in the election, but I think what happens on the street feeds into the election. I saw someone post on Facebook that what happens in Minneapolis is more important than the Democratic primaries. And in some ways, I agree with that. I think like Biden says that he's this champion of, you know, of Black working people in this country. Show us that it's true. And the way that we actually can push any politician is to have the movement on the streets, to have the power on the streets, to have real grassroots self-organized political power that actually shows like we won't be campaigning for you just because you get the Democratic nomination. You need to stand for something, and he doesn't. And I think that, you know, creating the power outside of that is what people should be doing now, leading up until November as well. And I also just wanted to mention that the socialist feminists in the DSA put out a statement calling for Biden to withdraw because he is a sexual abuser. I signed that statement. I think any other DSA member should do the same, because I think that, you know, this is not a candidate who's going to fix the incredible structural inequality that we have in this society, and I don't think he deserves the left's support.
Thanks, Claire. Before you go, Charlie, I wanted to add on another question that we received in from Chris in San Diego. Charlie, can you please speak to the scandal within the Labour Party of party officials essentially working to lose the 2017 election? Why hasn't it received much media attention, and how has the left in the UK responded to these revelations?
Well, thank you for those questions. Let me say something about Podemos, first of all, in the Spanish state. Podemos was another feature of that wave of resistance that I spoke about that followed the economic crisis and the sense of a complete lack of political representation for people. It was an expression of the M15 movement, the great occupation of the squares, what in Britain is known as the Indignados movement, of the Occupy movement, if you like, of a sense of an uprising over the lack of democracy, over issues like housing, over the question of job losses and so on. It was a very hopeful period. Podemos always said that it was not a movement of the left or the right. I can remember going to a meeting with leading Podemos figures in London, at which, for example, they said, we don't take a position on what happened during the Spanish Revolution and the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, because we don't want to see ourselves as a party of the left or a party of the right. We're a party of the people against the caste at the top of Spanish society. Now, that meant that it was both a beacon of struggle. It could call a demonstration, for example, of which hundreds of thousands of people went on the streets demanding a different sort of society, and yet was also seeing itself as not interested on being at the fringes of politics. It wanted to achieve governmental office in order to bring about the sorts of change that it spoke about. It spoke very well about ordinary people's resistance, and at the same time saw the mechanism by which that was going to come was entirely through the parliamentary system. For a while it could balance those two things. Very quickly it became much less democratic. The intervention and participation of ordinary people from below became much less, and then it became attracted towards the idea that what it had to do was to find a coalition partner in order to bring about the sorts of changes it wanted, because it wasn't going to get elected itself as a majority party. And it's now ended up in coalition with PSOE, the mainstream social democratic party, the equivalent of the Labour Party in the Spanish state, implementing, imposing, policing the return to work of Spanish workers with the easing of the lockdown. Far too early, actually. Far too early for the health and safety of workers. And as the questioner quite rightly said, has made huge concessions around the question of Catalonian independence. You know, there was a massive uprising of people in Catalonia saying that they wanted the right to decide their own future. This is a mortal threat to the constitution of the Spanish state, which talks about the unity of Spain and of the fact that none of the minorities in the Spanish state are allowed to break away. And the Catalonian movement was repressed by the most brutal means. Instead of lining up with those who were fighting against the Spanish cops, Podemos found itself on the wrong side in terms of that argument and ended up supporting the unity of the Spanish state, which meant lining up with the ruling class's position around it. Now, of course, there are many good people inside Podemos, but again, the structures and methods of the reformist project of seeking to work inside the way in which the system presently exists, this is what was disastrous for Podemos, and means that it's now been pulled into being a junior partner of precisely the sort of government which it said at the start of the process it was determined to destroy and break from. A party that claims it is of the left, but which nonetheless serves the ruling class's interests. It's a salutary story. It's the same story as that of Syriza. It's the same story as that of British Labour Party or the French Socialist Party or many, many others, or the SPD in Germany, about which I could speak. Now, a questioner raised the issue of the way in which the right had sabotaged the Corbyn project. It's a very, very important question because it reveals to us the motivation of those inside the Labour Party machine. You see, many of those on the Labour right used to say, we're against Jeremy Corbyn because we don't believe he's electable. He can't win an election. And this is the rationale of the Labour Party, that we have to win elections. We are against Corbyn because he isn't going to win an election. It turns out that for many of those inside the machine, what they worried about more was that Corbyn might win an election. He might be electable and come to office and therefore start raising the sorts of issues which the right wing didn't want raised at all. And therefore they deliberately sabotaged his attempts to be elected. I mean, the documents that we've seen are those from 2017, but I'm absolutely sure that that continued afterwards. Now, why did they do that? It is because their loyalty was not really to that of social transformation, not at all. Their loyalty was to the system of capitalism, maybe a bit prettified, a bit nicer than now, but nonetheless to a capitalist system which could then perhaps produce some more profits, which could be shared out in a more equitable way and enable ordinary people to raise their standards of living a little bit. Now, that's a scandal. And when you read it, they make the most appalling racist, sexist, homophobic remarks. They delight in the humiliation of Diane Abbott, one of the leading black figures inside the Labour Party. They delight in everything that goes badly for Corbyn, the leader of their own party, for goodness sake. They deliberately sabotage what he's doing and manipulate what's going on inside the party to try and break him, particularly around the alleged anti-Semitism question. It tells you that, but also it raises another question. How could it be that Corbyn and the left ran this party, and yet they allowed this festering sore of right-wing cabals to exist inside the establishment of the party, within the way the party operated, and not intervene to prevent it? Why didn't they have a war against the right? And this returns to the point I made earlier. Because you're a parliamentary party, because you believe in the unity of all those inside the organisation, you have to allow the right wing to exist. You don't have a war against them. And this is the difference between a party like the Labour Party and a revolutionary organisation. In a revolutionary organisation, you can't be a racist. You can't be a sexist. You can't be homophobic. You can't believe that British imperialism was a wonderful thing, or that the war on Iraq was necessary for democracy. You can't believe any of that and be in our party. In the Labour Party, you can. Indeed, Jeremy Corbyn allowed a free vote amongst his MPs about whether it was right to bomb Syria or not, and therefore allowed a substantial chunk of them to vote for imperialist slaughter. Now that tells us something, not just about the specifics of the Labour Party. It's a broader feature which is at stake here. And that's why we have to talk about a different form of organisation, a different form of politics, a break from the mainstream.
Thank you, Charlie. And thanks to all of you for submitting some great questions here. Charlie, I want to ask you to come back on a question from Nicholas Sue, who is in San Francisco. He asks, in the US left, we have a tradition of criticizing the idea of, quote, using Democrat Party institutions to create social change. We call it the graveyard of social movements. Has the end of Corbynism proven that the Labour Party is now equivalent to the Democratic Party in the US and a new party would need to be built in the UK? And Claire, Victor in Los Angeles asks, is it worth it as Marx21 to support Howie Hawkins or to try to get the DSA to support Hawkins? Howie Hawkins and Angela Walker are the presumptive nominees for the president and vice president of the Green Party in the United States. And then, and to end, a last question for both of you. Eric in New York State asks, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has sometimes been a beacon of sanity in the House. She spoke well as a lone voice, voting against the giveaways to the rich in the CARES Act for the coronavirus stimulus plan. Yet she hasn't played a role in building a movement with activists and unions against that giveaway. So to both of you, both of our speakers, is there a role for elected socialists for building struggles outside the government? And Charlie, if you don't mind, would you go first?
Certainly. Happy to do that. Look, I don't think the Labour Party is exactly the same as the Democrats. I think it still has some link to working class organisation. But that's not the end of the argument. I joined the Socialist Workers Party 43 years ago because a Labour government, the government of 1974 to 1979, was carrying through the biggest assault upon working class living standards in British history. In British history, until very, very recent, in the recent
I think we've lost Charlie's sound. So we're going to give him a couple seconds to see if he comes back online. And we're going to just go to Claire now while we work on Charlie's tech issues. Sorry about this, folks. Claire, do you mind stepping in, please?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think, thank you for both of those questions. I think they're great. I'll take the question about AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York first. Yeah, I think this goes back, I think, to some of the structure and strategy of the DSA a little bit. AOC is ostensibly a member of the DSA, but she's going to be voting for Biden. I mean, she says she hasn't endorsed him, but I think saying that she'll be voting for him publicly is endorsing him. It does tell all of her followers to vote for him as well. And I think, you know, that again raises the question of independence from the Democrats and having an independent revolutionary organization, because there's, you know, part of it is, it's not, I don't even think about AOC as a person or as an activist. I think it's a question of the way that involving yourself in bourgeois government and in a capitalist government really constrains what you can do. There's a sense that, you know, you have to play the game, you need a seat at the table, and AOC certainly has a seat at the table. She's going to be heading up the environment task force in a Biden government, if that is what eventuates. So I think, you know, we have to be very clear that, you know, it's great that she got elected. The things that she said, I think, are a breath of fresh air compared to most other Democrats in the House. But we need independence from that. We are not accountable to Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer, or, you know, we're not accountable to the Democratic Party. AOC is, in a way, because of her position. And I think there's all kinds of good stuff that she can do in that position, and we should applaud her when that happens, but we have to be able to criticize her when that doesn't happen. So yeah, I think that, yeah, we have to be able to keep our independence and know that, like, our job as a left is to pressure her not to fall in line behind her or the Democrats. But yeah, I think that's how I would answer that. On the question of Howie Hawkins and the Green Party, I think it's true that that's sort of the only electoral alternative to vote for this year or any other year right now that that I think is defensible, and I think that people who are planning to vote this year, I think, should choose a vote for Howie Hawkins over Joe Biden. But I think, you know, it's not, I don't think it's a solution or a silver bullet to the situation that we're in. The Green Party, for all kinds of complicated reasons, doesn't have like a long-term movement building orientation either. It's partly to do with its size and the cost of running in elections, but like we need a political formation that is active every single day, building the resistance, not just when an election is happening. I think we can go and we can vote, but that's one thing, like vote, but vote with your feet, get active, become part of a movement that's not just, you know, trapped in this narrow cycle. I think it could be something worth raising in the DSA, because there are comrades who are very fed up with the Democratic Party, but I also think we'll, you know, we'll get a lot of pushback on that, because the Green Party is very small and it's a protest vote. It's not the type of vote that's going to change the balance of forces in the United States, I don't think. So yeah, I think people should and could vote for him, but I think, again, as what I said before, and I think what Charlie's been saying, is that the primary thing we need to be doing is not, it's the Howard Zinn quote, it's not who is sitting in the White House, it's not who you cast your ballot for in the election, it's who's sitting in the streets and fighting in the workplaces. And I think that is exactly where our energy needs to be, and that's the argument to wage inside the DSA as well, more so than the electoral stuff.
Thanks so much, Claire. As we're waiting to see if we can rejoin with Charlie, I wanted to make some announcements. We are nearing the end of our meeting in general. Thanks to everyone for contributing, joining us today. If you'd like regular anti-capitalist analysis and politics, just like you've heard in our meeting, please visit our website, which is Marx21US.org. And you'll see that in the chat as well. To sign up with us and to stay in touch about future events like this, we are going to send you a form in the chat. You can click onto that. We can take down your contact information, and we'll be reaching out to you soon after this meeting, and we'll be able to stay in touch. If you're interested in diving in deeper and having discussions about these sorts of topics, please join the Marx21 How Marxism Works reading group, and the details can be found here in this link. And then over Facebook, we will be sending more details about a June 11th branch meeting on George Floyd and the movement that's rising up against the police brutality that ends all the activity that we're seeing in the streets now. So there are a number of ways to keep in touch with us and to join us. So please, everyone should feel welcome to sign up, and we'll definitely be in touch. Okay, we are getting word that Charlie is trying to come back. And so as soon as he does, we are going to rejoin with him and hear his final thoughts. All right, everyone, we're just waiting for our final speaker, Charlie Kimber from Great Britain, to rejoin with us. He had a little bit of technical difficulty, but he is trying to rejoin us, and we'll be able to wrap up the meeting in a few minutes. Claire, did you want to make any final announcements as well as we're waiting for Charlie here?
Sure. I just wanted to say, for anyone who's watching in Los Angeles, there's currently a protest going on for justice for George Floyd, but there's another one happening later this afternoon at 3 p.m. in Mariachi Plaza. So anyone who's out in LA, I'll be there. Other ones of our comrades will be there, hopefully to see there with masks on and as distant as we can be. And also just wanted to mention, while we're waiting, both Charlie and I are editors of our respective revolutionary publications, and I just want to say a couple of things about our website. We have a brilliant article by one of our comrades, Marie, who wrote about the economic stimulus packages and the way that it's been a massive transfer of wealth to the rich, which I really encourage people to look at Marx21US.org. Another article by another one of our comrades, Thomas, about mutual aid and kind of some critiques of that strategy and the possibilities for building mutual aid as a type of solidarity into a more organized form of resistance, which will be coming out in the next couple of days if it's not already up. And we also have our statement on the riots and the murder of George Floyd, which is also up on our website. So please go ahead and take a look at some of those articles, and also I'll give a plug while he's not here, Charlie's website, socialistworker.co.uk, which has a lot of coverage of US events, but also other political discussions.
Thanks so much for those important announcements, Claire. Folks, you should add, if you guys have any announcements out there in your local towns and cities, please feel free to send us a note on our Facebook page. We'd love to hear about them. We'd love to see pictures if there's activity and protests that you're participating in your city. We know what's happening, not only in this country, but actually around the world. So we'd love to hear more about this. We are still waiting and hoping that Charlie Kimber can rejoin us, but the Zoom gods might not be smiling upon us today. So I think we are not able to rejoin with Charlie. So apologies for that abrupt cutoff with him. Hopefully we got a lot more out of the rest of the meeting, and we really appreciate everyone for joining us today. We hope that you can join us on the upcoming events that we've announced. Check back on our Facebook page frequently, and please join us. We're Marx21. Thanks a lot, folks, and have a great rest of your day.